He was just digging a pool in his backyard and didn't expect anything unusual. But beneath the ground, an old ambulance was buried. When police opened it, everyone was shocked by what they saw. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The street where Michael lived looked like hundreds of others scattered across the southern suburbs of the United States. A long stretch of asphalt softened by heat, identical mailboxes planted at equal distances, trimmed lawns that smelled of fresh water and fertilizer, and houses painted in calm, reassuring colors chosen to offend no one. In the early mornings, before traffic woke up and before lawnmowers began their steady whining, the neighborhood seemed almost suspended in time. That was the hour Michael liked most. He woke before the alarm, as he usually did, his body trained by years of physical work to rise with the light rather than the clock. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing somewhere far away, closer to the highway than to their street. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, noticing the thin crack that ran from one corner toward the center. A crack he had promised himself he would fix someday. It had been there since they bought the house. It had not grown, but it had not disappeared either. He got out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Lisa. She lay on her side, one arm tucked under the pillow, her breathing slow and even. Michael paused for a second, watching her, feeling that quiet sense of responsibility that came with long years of shared life. He pulled on a t-shirt and work pants, moved through the hallway, and stepped into the kitchen. Morning light filtered in through the blinds, turning the dust in the air into something almost visible. The kitchen smelled faintly of yesterday's coffee and the dish soap Lisa used, a smell that meant home to him more than any decoration or piece of furniture ever could. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and stood by the back door while it cooled, looking out at the yard. The backyard was larger than most in the neighborhood, one of the reasons they had chosen the house. A rectangle of uneven grass bordered by a wooden fence that leaned just slightly in places, enough to notice if you were looking for it. Beyond the fence were other yards, other fences, other families starting their days in similar quiet routines. The ground near the center of the yard dipped almost imperceptibly, a shallow depression that collected water after heavy rain. Michael had noticed it during the inspection years ago, had asked the agent about it, and had been told it was nothing, just natural settling. At the time, that explanation had been enough. He took a sip of coffee and felt the familiar bitterness settle him. Today was supposed to be the start of something good. He had been planning it for months, sketching rough measurements on scrap paper, watching videos late at night after the kids were asleep, calculating costs and timelines in his head. A swimming pool. Not a luxury resort thing, not something flashy, just a simple in-ground pool where his kids could spend their summers instead of being glued to screens, where Lisa could sit with her feet in the water after work, where he could feel, for once, that he had built something lasting with his own hands. When the kids came into the kitchen, the quiet broke in the familiar way. Chairs scraped against the floor. Cereal boxes were opened and closed, voices overlapped. Michael answered questions half automatically, his mind already shifting toward the work ahead. Lisa came in last, tying her hair back, already dressed for the day. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter, watching him. "You're really starting today?" she asked. He nodded. Groundwork, just digging, marking things out. She smiled, but there was something cautious behind it. "Just be careful, and don't go too deep too fast." He gave a small laugh. "I've done my homework." She raised an eyebrow, a familiar gesture that said she trusted him, but not completely. They had had versions of this conversation before, about projects that grew larger than intended, about time and money and exhaustion. Still, she didn't argue. She knew how much this meant to him. After breakfast, after backpacks were shouldered and doors slammed and the house emptied out, Michael stepped back into the yard with a different kind of focus. The rented mini excavator sat near the fence, its metal arms catching the sunlight. He had picked it up the night before, following the clerk's instructions carefully, nodding as if everything was obvious even when it wasn't. He ran his hand along the cool metal now, feeling a mix of anticipation and responsibility. Before starting, he walked the yard again, measuring tape in hand, stakes and string marking out the rough shape of the future pool. He drove the stakes into the ground with a hammer, the dull thud echoing softly. The soil was firm but workable, a mix of clay and dirt that clung to the metal when he tested it with a shovel. It smelled earthy, clean. There was nothing about it that suggested trouble. As he worked, neighbors passed by on the sidewalk, offering nods, small comments. One joked about inviting himself over once the pool was done. Another asked how deep he planned to go. Michael answered easily, enjoying the sense of shared normalcy. This was the kind of project people understood. It fit the neighborhood, fit the image of a man improving his home. By mid-morning, the sun was higher, the air warmer. Michael started the excavator, the engine's vibration traveling up through the seat and into his bones. He eased the bucket into the ground where he had marked the shallow end, lifting out the first load of earth and dumping it to the side. The machine made the work easier, but he still felt every movement, every resistance. He liked that. It reminded him that progress came from effort, even when machines helped. Hour by hour, the hole grew. He stopped occasionally to adjust measurements, to check depth, to drink water and wipe sweat from his face. The kids' drawings of the pool, taped to the fridge inside, came to his mind now and then. He pictured them jumping in, laughing, splashing. He pictured Lisa sitting at the edge, shoes off, talking about her day. These images fueled him. Around noon, as he guided the bucket into the ground again, he felt a change. The resistance shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The excavator jerked slightly, the bucket stopping short of where he expected it to go. At first, he assumed he had hit a particularly dense patch of clay or a buried rock. It wasn't unusual. He adjusted his angle and tried again. The bucket struck something solid with a sound that was different from stone. A dull metallic thud reverberated through the machine. Michael froze, hands still on the controls, heart skipping a beat. He shut off the engine and climbed down, the sudden silence making the moment feel heavier. He grabbed a shovel and stepped into the shallow pit, crouching to clear away dirt by hand. The soil came away in clumps, revealing a smooth, rust-stained surface beneath. He brushed it with his glove, then with his bare hand. Metal? Not rebar, not a pipe. A broad, flat expanse of metal, curved slightly. Too large to be debris, too deliberate to be random. Michael straightened slowly, scanning the hole, his mind racing through possibilities. An old tank? A buried shed? Something left behind by previous owners? None of it made sense. He cleared more dirt, widening the exposed area. As the shape became clearer, his stomach tightened. It was the roof of a vehicle. He stood there for a long moment, sweat cooling on his skin, the quiet backyard suddenly feeling less quiet. The fence, the grass, the familiar surroundings all seemed to recede as his attention locked onto the shape beneath the earth. A vehicle did not belong here. Not like this. not buried whole. Michael swallowed and kept digging, slower now, more careful. With each scrape of the shovel, more of the truth emerged. A window frame, a hint of faded paint, a line that might once have been a part of a stripe. He knew, even before the thought fully formed, that whatever he was uncovering was not just an inconvenience or a curiosity. It was something that had been placed here on purpose, something someone had wanted hidden. He stepped back out of the pit and looked around his yard, at the fence, at the neighboring houses, at the quiet street beyond. Everything looked the same as it had that morning. Birds still moved along the fence line. Somewhere a lawn sprinkler clicked on, but the ground beneath his feet was no longer just ground. Michael stood there, alone in his backyard, staring down at the buried shape, and felt a weight settle in his chest. He had wanted to build something that would bring his family closer, something simple and good. Instead, with one unexpected strike of metal against metal, he had opened something else entirely. He did not yet know what it was, only that it was big and old and hidden for a reason, and whatever it was, it had been waiting there a long time. Michael did not call anyone right away. He stood there for several minutes after stepping away from the pit, letting the reality of what he had uncovered settle in his body before it settled in his mind. The metal roof, partially exposed and streaked with rust, seemed unreal, like something staged, something that belonged in a photograph or a news story rather than beneath his own backyard. The air felt heavier, though nothing around him had changed. The same quiet street, the same fence, the same sun climbing higher in the sky. He climbed back into the pit with the shovel, not because he was sure of what he was doing, but because standing still felt worse. The soil came away easily near the edges, darker and damp where it had been compressed for years. He worked slowly now, careful not to strike the metal again with force. With each scoop, more of the shape revealed itself, and with each reveal, the situation became harder to deny. It was a vehicle without question. Not a small one either. The curve of the roof extended farther than he had expected, disappearing back into the dirt. He brushed away soil near one edge and uncovered the top of a side window, the glass clouded but intact. The fact that it had not shattered suggested the vehicle had been placed here deliberately, not dropped or crushed. That thought alone made his hands tremble slightly. Michael climbed out again and wiped his palms on his pants. He looked toward the house, half expecting someone to be watching him through the window. The curtains were open, the kitchen empty. Lisa was at work. The kids were at school. For the moment, whatever this was belonged to him alone. He circled the pit, studying it from different angles, trying to understand how something this large could have been buried without anyone noticing. The hole he had dug so far was not deep enough to fully expose the vehicle, but deep enough to make one thing clear. This was not a car that had simply sunk into the ground over time. The earth around it showed signs of disturbance, layers that did not match the natural settling he was used to seeing. Someone had dug a hole. Someone had lowered this vehicle into it. Someone had filled it back in. The thought made his mouth dry. He returned to the excavator and started it again, the engine noise breaking the stillness with sudden violence. He hesitated with his hands on the controls, then lowered the bucket carefully, widening the hole around the metal roof rather than digging deeper. The machine responded smoothly, peeling away soil in controlled arcs. Michael dumped the dirt farther away now, creating a clear perimeter. As more of the vehicle emerged, the details became harder to ignore. A red stripe, faded almost to brown, ran along the side. faint lettering appeared beneath the grime. He shut off the engine again and leaned down, scraping gently with the edge of the shovel until the letters became readable. Ambulance. The word hit him harder than the metal had. He sat back on his heels in the dirt, staring at it, his mind racing. An ambulance. Not a construction vehicle, not an old truck. An ambulance buried in his backyard. He stood abruptly and stepped out of the pit, pacing along the grass. His heart was pounding now, not with excitement, but with a rising sense of dread. An ambulance carried people. An ambulance was part of emergencies, of accidents, of life and death. It did not belong underground. Michael pulled his phone from his pocket and checked the time. It was early afternoon. Lisa would be at work for hours yet. He considered calling her, then stopped himself. He did not know what to say. I found something strange sounded insufficient. I found an ambulance buried in the yard sounded absurd. He went back to the pit and continued clearing soil, driven by the need to see the full extent of what he was dealing with. The more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The ambulance lay on its wheels, upright, as if it had been driven into the hole or lowered carefully. The front end was angled slightly downward, suggesting the hole had not been perfectly level when it was placed. The headlights were intact, their plastic yellowed but unbroken. The grill was packed with dirt. Michael worked until his arms ached and sweat soaked through his shirt. By the time he stopped, the upper half of the ambulance was fully exposed. It was old, older than he had initially thought. The design, the boxy shape, the style of lettering all pointed to something from at least a decade ago, maybe more. The paint was chipped and rust had eaten into the seams, but it was unmistakable. He stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at it, and felt a strange mix of fear and responsibility. This was not something he could ignore, not something he could cover back up and pretend had never been there. Even if he wanted to, the damage was done. The hole was open. The vehicle was visible. Anyone walking by could see it if they looked over the fence. As if summoned by the thought, a voice called out from the other side of the fence, "What the hell is that?" Michael turned to see his neighbor, Tom, standing on a step stool in his own yard, peering over. Tom was retired, the kind of man who knew everyone's business and treated curiosity as a full-time job. Michael hesitated, then walked over. "It's an ambulance," he said, the words sounding strange even as he spoke them. Tom's eyebrows shot up. "You're kidding." Michael shook his head and gestured toward the pit. Tom leaned farther over the fence, whistling softly. "Well, that's not something you see every day," he said. "You call someone?" "Not yet," Michael replied. Tom climbed down from the stool and reappeared moments later at the gate. Michael hesitated again, then unlocked it. Tom walked into the yard, stopping short when he saw the full scope of the excavation. "Someone buried this," Tom said, more to himself than to Michael. "They didn't just leave it here." "That's what I'm thinking," Michael said. They stood in silence for a moment, both staring down at the ambulance. Tom scratched his chin. "You know," he said slowly, "this kind of thing, you probably want the police involved." Michael nodded. "Yeah, I know. But," Tom continued, lowering his voice, "once you do that, it's not your yard anymore. Not for a while, anyway." Michael knew what he meant. Police tape, questions, attention. His quiet project turning into something public and uncontrollable. He looked back at the house, at the sliding glass door that led to the kitchen where his kids ate breakfast that morning. "I just wanted to build a pool," he said quietly. Tom gave a humorless chuckle. "Looks like you dug up something else instead." They returned to the pit together. Michael pointed out the details he had noticed, the intact windows, the upright position. Tom crouched down, peering through one of the side windows, but the interior was dark, obscured by grime. "Doors open?" Tom asked. "Don't know," Michael said. "Haven't tried." They moved toward the rear of the ambulance. The back doors were visible now, their handles rusted, the seams packed with dirt. Michael reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering inches from the metal. Something about opening those doors felt like crossing a line. Up to now, he had uncovered something hidden. Opening it would mean confronting whatever had been hidden inside. "You sure you want to do that?" Tom asked, reading his hesitation. Michael straightened. "I don't know." Tom nodded. "Might be better to wait. Let professionals handle it." Michael exhaled slowly. He knew Tom was right. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at him. The ambulance sat there like a question mark embedded in the earth, demanding an answer. They covered part of the pit with a tarp as a temporary measure, more to keep dirt from falling in than to hide anything. Tom promised to keep quiet for now, though Michael knew that meant little in a neighborhood like this. After Tom left, Michael locked the gate and stood alone again. The sun was beginning to dip slightly, the light shifting from harsh to warm. Michael sat on the edge of the pit, his legs dangling into the hole, and tried to think logically. An ambulance buried in his yard meant a crime, or at least an attempt to hide evidence. There was no scenario in which this was harmless. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping on Lisa's name. He hesitated, then called. "Hey," she said, "everything okay?" Michael swallowed. "I found something." "What do you mean, something?" There's an ambulance buried in the yard." There was a pause on the line. "You're joking." "I wish I was." Another pause, longer this time. "Is it empty?" "I don't know," Michael said. "I haven't opened it." "Michael," she said, her voice tight, "you need to call the police." "I know." "When?" He looked at the pit, at the tarp, at the quiet yard. "Soon," he said. "I just wanted you to hear it from me first." They talked for a few more minutes, Lisa asking questions he could not yet answer, her concern growing with each unknown. When the call ended, Michael felt no relief. If anything, the weight had grown heavier. As evening approached, he cleaned up his tools mechanically, moving through familiar motions with an unfamiliar mind. He showered, the water running brown at first as dirt washed away, and dressed in clean clothes. He ate dinner alone, barely tasting it, the image of the buried ambulance intruding on every thought. When night fell, he went back outside. The yard looked different in the dim light, the pit a dark shape in the ground, the tarp barely visible. He stood there, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling down, and felt a deep unease settle in his chest. He knew he could not sleep without acting. Whatever lay beneath that tarp would not stay contained by indecision. Michael took out his phone again, his thumb hovering over the screen. He thought of his kids, of Lisa, of the promise of a pool that now felt like a lifetime ago. Then he dialed the number he had been avoiding. As the phone rang, he stared out into the darkness of his backyard, knowing that with this call, the quiet life he had known there was about to end. The first patrol car arrived less than 20 minutes after Michael made the call. Its lights were not flashing, but the presence of the vehicle alone altered the atmosphere of the street. The quiet that had once felt ordinary now felt strained, as if every sound were being measured. Michael stood by the gate when the officers stepped out, his hands visible, his posture stiff with the awareness that everything he did from this moment on would be observed, noted, possibly questioned later. They were younger than he expected, both of them, their uniforms crisp, their expressions professional but cautious. Michael explained what he had found, choosing his words carefully, sticking to facts, pointing toward the backyard without embellishment. One of the officers asked him to repeat the timeline, when he had started digging, when he had struck the metal, whether anyone else had touched the vehicle. Michael answered honestly, admitting that he had uncovered part of it himself but had not opened the doors. They followed him into the yard, flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. When the beam of light passed over the tarp and then beneath it, illuminating the rusted side of the ambulance, the officers exchanged a glance that confirmed what Michael already knew. This was no longer a routine call. They asked him to step back while they took photographs and made a brief inspection. One of them spoke into his radio in a low voice, using codes Michael did not understand. The other crouched near the pit, shining his light through the side window. He straightened slowly. "It's definitely an ambulance," he said, as if there had been any doubt. "Older model." "Is it empty?" Michael asked before he could stop himself. The officer looked at him for a moment. "We don't know yet." More vehicles arrived soon after, a supervisor, then another car marked with a different unit designation. The yard filled with quiet activity, people moving deliberately, speaking in measured tones. A length of tape appeared and was stretched across the gate, then another along the fence line. Michael's backyard, the place where his children had played and where he had planned to build something joyful, became something else entirely. Lisa arrived just as the rear doors of the ambulance were being examined. She had left work early, her face pale, her movements quick and restless. Michael met her near the house, and for a moment they stood together, watching strangers occupy their space. "Are you okay?" she asked, gripping his arm. "I think so," he said, though the words felt uncertain even as he spoke them. They were asked to stay back while a pair of officers approached the rear of the ambulance. The metal doors were rusted shut, the seals clogged with dirt. One officer used a crowbar, working it carefully into the seam, applying steady pressure. The metal protested with a groan that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Michael felt his chest tighten as the door shifted, just enough to break the seal. A smell escaped, not the sharp, unmistakable odor Michael had feared, but something stale and earthy, like a closed basement after years of neglect. The doors were pulled open wider, the hinges creaking. Flashlights swept the interior. Michael watched from a distance, his mind filling the gaps before his eyes could. He had expected chaos, blood, something dramatic. Instead, what he saw when the light settled was almost mundane, and that made it worse. The interior was intact but stripped. The stretcher frame was there, bolted to the floor, but the mattress was gone. Cabinets lined the walls, some open, some closed, their contents sparse. Loose papers lay scattered on the floor, stuck together by moisture and time. A medical bag sat near the back, half collapsed, its zipper corroded. One of the officers stepped inside, careful where he placed his feet. He lifted the bag and set it down near the doors, opening it for inspection. Inside were empty blister packs, cracked vials, a pair of dried gloves. Nothing that explained why the ambulance had been buried. Another officer pointed to the front of the compartment, toward the partition separating the driver's area. "There's more," he said. They moved forward, opening compartments, checking under seats. Michael found himself leaning forward unconsciously, his attention narrowing. He wanted answers, even if he feared them. The officer reached beneath the driver's seat and paused. He pulled out a slim black folder, its edges warped, the surface gritty with dirt. He held it up for the others to see. Michael's breath caught. Something about the folder felt heavier than the rest of the scene, as if it carried meaning beyond its physical weight. The officers began going through it carefully, gloved hands turning pages that stuck together, revealing lists and notes written in different inks, names, dates, addresses. Some pages were official-looking, printed forms with boxes and lines. Others were handwritten, hurried, messy. Lisa squeezed Michael's arm. "What is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said, though a cold understanding was beginning to take shape. The officers spoke quietly among themselves, their expressions tightening as they compared entries. One of them looked up at Michael. "Did you touch this?" he asked. "No," Michael said immediately. "I didn't open anything." The officer nodded, as if satisfied, and returned his attention to the folder. As the search continued, more items were removed. Several old mobile phones, their screens cracked, no SIM cards inside. A bundle of cash, wrapped in plastic and tucked into a compartment beneath the bench seat. Not a fortune, but enough to raise questions. Michael felt a growing sense of unreality. These were not the contents of an abandoned emergency vehicle. They were the remnants of something intentional, something organized. The officers eventually stepped back, sealing the ambulance again, this time with evidence tape. The supervisor approached Michael and Lisa, his tone calm but firm. "We're going to need to secure this area," he said. "This is potentially connected to a serious investigation." "Are we in trouble?" Lisa asked, her voice tight. "No," the supervisor said. "At this point, you're witnesses. You did the right thing by calling us." Michael wanted to believe him. Still, the word witnesses echoed in his mind, carrying implications he was not ready to face. They were asked to recount everything again, separately this time. Michael described the digging, the metal, the discovery, careful to include every detail. Lisa explained when she had arrived what she had seen. Both were told not to discuss the situation with anyone for the time being. When the officers finally left for the night, the yard remained cordoned off. A single cruiser stayed parked at the curb, its presence a silent reminder that nothing about this was over. Inside the house, the air felt different. Lisa moved through the rooms restlessly, checking locks, peering out windows. Michael sat at the kitchen table, the same place where he had drunk his coffee that morning, and tried to process the speed at which everything had changed. What if there was someone in there? Lisa asked quietly, standing by the counter. Michael shook his head. They would have said something. But what if there was, and they just haven't told us yet? He had no answer for that. They slept little that night. Every sound outside seemed amplified, every passing car a potential threat. Michael lay awake, staring at the ceiling crack, thinking about the folder, the names inside it, the lives hinted at by those pages. The next morning, the investigation intensified. Crime scene technicians arrived, followed by detectives who introduced themselves and began asking deeper questions. The folder, it turned out, was a log of sorts, not an official one. A parallel record of ambulance calls that did not appear in any public database. Michael was shown photocopies of a few pages. Names were listed without last names. Addresses repeated in clusters. Dates spanned several years, ending abruptly around the time the ambulance had presumably been buried. These people were picked up. one of the detectives explained, choosing his words carefully, but there's no record of them being admitted to hospitals. Where did they go? Michael asked. That's what we're trying to find out. As the day wore on, Michael watched his backyard transform into a full-scale operation. Soil samples were taken. Measurements were recorded. Photographs documented every angle. The ambulance was partially uncovered further, its identification numbers searched for any trace that might remain. By afternoon, the detectives had confirmed something that sent a chill through Michael. The ambulance was registered to a private emergency service company that had shut down years earlier. According to official records, the vehicle had been destroyed in a fire. Insurance claims had been filed, paperwork completed. Yet, here it was, intact beneath his yard. Lisa listened as the detectives explained what that meant. Someone had lied. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase this vehicle from existence. And the people in the log? She asked. The detective met her eyes. Some of them have been reported missing. The word missing hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. That evening, after the investigators had left again, Michael stood alone in the yard, staring at the taped-off pit. He thought of the people whose names were written in that folder, of the calls that had been made, of the ambulance that had never delivered them to safety. He had uncovered a machine designed to save lives, repurposed for something else entirely, and by doing so, he had placed himself and his family at the center of a story far darker than anything he had imagined when he first put a shovel into the ground. As he went back inside, locking the door behind him, Michael understood one thing with unsettling clarity. Whatever had happened inside that ambulance did not end when it was buried. It had merely been paused, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to bring it back into the light. The morning after the ambulance was opened did not bring clarity. It brought structure, procedures layered over shock, and a slow realization that what Michael and Lisa had stumbled into would not be contained by daylight or by the calm voices of professionals. The house woke early, not because anyone had slept well, but because there was no longer a way to pretend that routine could smooth over what had happened. Michael moved through the kitchen as if through a place he no longer fully recognized, aware of how every object seemed to carry a memory from only days ago, when the backyard had been nothing more than a promise. The children sensed it first, the way children often do. They were quieter than usual, glancing toward the sliding glass door as if expecting something to appear beyond it. Michael explained only what he felt he could, that there had been a problem with the digging, that the police needed to check something before work could continue. He did not say ambulance. He did not say documents or missing people. He did not say anything that would take root in their minds and grow into fear. By the time the kids left for school, escorted by Lisa rather than allowed to walk alone as they sometimes did, the first police vehicles of the day had already arrived. They parked with deliberate spacing, not blocking the street but making their presence unmistakable. Neighbors slowed as they passed, heads turning, curiosity sharpened by the sight of uniformed officers returning to a quiet block that was unaccustomed to attention. Michael stood near the gate as the tape was reinforced. The perimeter expanded slightly. He recognized one of the detectives from the day before, a woman with steady eyes and a calm way of speaking that suggested she had learned to keep distance between herself and the worst parts of her work. She greeted him by name, which unsettled him more than if she had not remembered it. "We're going to need to ask you a few more questions," she said, "and we'll need your cooperation for the next steps." "What kind of steps?" Michael asked. She glanced towards the pit, then back at him. This isn't just about the vehicle anymore. The contents raise serious concerns. We have to treat this as a potential crime scene tied to other cases." The words "potential crime scene" carried a weight that pressed against Michael's chest. He nodded, though he was not sure what he was agreeing to. Cooperation sounded reasonable in theory. In practice, it meant surrendering control over the one place he had thought was entirely his. Inside, Lisa listened as Michael relayed what the detective had said. She folded and unfolded her hands, her gaze fixed on the table. "How long?" she asked. "I don't know," Michael said. "Days, weeks, maybe longer." "And what about us?" she asked quietly. "What about the kids?" Michael had no immediate answer. He had asked himself the same question since the night before, replaying scenarios in his head, each one ending with the same uncertainty. He knew they could not simply leave. This was their home. Their names were tied to the property. Walking away would raise questions of its own, questions they were not in a position to answer. The detective returned with a colleague, this one older, his manner more direct. They sat at the kitchen table, notebooks open, recording devices placed carefully between them. Michael and Lisa were asked to recount everything again, not just the discovery, but the purchase of the house, the inspection, the interactions with the real estate agent, any conversations with neighbors that might seem insignificant in hindsight. The questions were not accusatory, but they were thorough, and the repetition began to wear on them. When the detective asked if Michael had ever noticed anything unusual about the yard before the digging began, he hesitated. "There was a low spot," he said. "It collected water sometimes. I mentioned it during the inspection." "Did the inspector note it?" the detective asked. "I think so," Michael said. "They said it was normal settling." The detective nodded and wrote something down. They asked about the neighbor who had seen the ambulance, about the phone call to Lisa, about whether Michael had taken any photographs before the police arrived. Michael admitted that he had not, and for the first time since the discovery, he felt a small measure of relief at that fact. There were no images circulating, no evidence he had to explain beyond his words. When the questioning paused, the older detective leaned back slightly. "I want to be clear," he said. "Right now, you're not suspects. You did what you were supposed to do. But because this was found on your property, your involvement doesn't end with the initial report. We may need you to testify later. We may need access to your records, your communication logs, things like that." Lisa stiffened. "Access how?" "Subpoenas, if necessary," he said, "but we try to keep disruption to a minimum." Michael watched Lisa's face as the words landed. Disruption felt like a polite word for upheaval. After the detectives left, the house felt emptier than it had before they arrived. Lisa moved from room to room, straightening objects that did not need straightening, her hands restless. Michael stood by the window, watching technicians in protective gear move around the pit, marking areas with small flags. "What if we hadn't called?" Lisa said suddenly. Michael turned. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, as if trying to clear it. "I know we did the right thing, I know that. But what if we hadn't? What if we had just filled the hole back in and pretended it was nothing?" The question hung between them, heavy and unanswerable. Michael understood the impulse behind it, the desire to rewind, to choose ignorance over consequence. He also knew that the thought would not leave them easily. "We couldn't," he said finally, "not after seeing what it was." Lisa nodded, but her expression did not soften. "I just want our kids to be safe." "So do I," Michael said. "That's why we have to let this play out." The afternoon brought more activity. A crime scene unit arrived with equipment that looked more suited to a large public investigation than a backyard. They took soil samples, examined the edges of the pit, documented the condition of the ambulance in detail. Michael watched as a section of the fence was temporarily removed to allow better access. Each small change felt like a reminder that the space was no longer theirs alone. At one point, a uniformed officer approached Michael with a clipboard. "We'll need you to sign this," he said, indicating a form that granted permission for continued access to the property. Michael read it carefully, his name printed at the top, the legal language dense and precise. Signing felt like crossing another threshold, one that made the situation official in a way that words alone could not. He signed. Later, when the children returned from school, they were met not by the familiar sight of their yard, but by tape and strangers. Lisa intercepted them before they could ask questions, guiding them inside with gentle firmness. Michael watched their faces, the confusion there, and felt a sharp stab of guilt. He had wanted to build something for them. Instead, he had brought uncertainty to their doorstep. That evening, after dinner eaten in near silence, Michael and Lisa sat together in the living room. The television was off. The house felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. "We need to decide what we're going to tell people," Lisa said. "Friends, family, the kids' school." Michael rubbed his temples. "The detectives said not to talk to anyone yet." "I know," Lisa said, "but people are already asking questions. Someone from the PTA texted me." Michael sighed. "We'll keep it vague. Say there's a legal issue with the property. That's not a lie." Lisa nodded, but her eyes lingered on him. "And if this gets bigger?" Michael thought of the folder, of the names and dates that hinted at lives intersecting briefly with that ambulance before vanishing. "Then we deal with it," he said, "one step at a time." The night passed slowly. Michael slept in fragments, waking at every sound. At one point, he thought he heard footsteps outside, but when he looked through the window, there was nothing. Just the cruiser parked at the curb, its presence both reassuring and unsettling. The following day brought confirmation of what Michael had begun to suspect. The detectives returned with news that the ambulance was registered to a private emergency service that had ceased operations over a decade earlier. According to official records, the vehicle had been destroyed in a fire. Insurance claims had been settled, paperwork filed. The existence of the ambulance beneath Michael's yard meant that those records were false. "We're reopening several old cases," the detective said, "disappearances that were never fully explained." Lisa felt her stomach drop. "Disappearances?" "Yes," the detective said. "People who called for help and were never seen again." The words settled into the room like dust, coating every surface of their understanding. This was no longer about an abandoned vehicle or even hidden money. It was about people. That afternoon, as the investigation continued, Michael received a call from an unknown number. He let it go to voicemail, his unease rising. When he listened to the message later, it was brief. "I heard about what you found," a man's voice said. "You should be careful." There was no threat, no name, no further explanation, just the implication that news of the discovery was already spreading beyond official channels. Michael deleted the message, but could not erase its effect. He told Lisa, and they sat together again, the same question unspoken between them. Had they made themselves targets by doing the right thing? That night, they talked in whispers, planning contingencies they had never imagined needing. Who would the kids stay with if something happened? Should they install additional locks, cameras? Should they consider staying somewhere else temporarily? In the end, they decided to stay. Leaving now would look suspicious, and more importantly, it would not change what had already been set in motion. They would cooperate fully, trust the process as much as possible, and protect their children in the ways they could. As Michael lay in bed, staring at the familiar ceiling crack, he understood that the choice they had made was no longer just about legality or morality. It was about accepting that their lives had been altered in a fundamental way. The backyard that had once symbolized stability had become a point of convergence for hidden histories, for truths buried and now exposed. The call he had made had set all of this in motion, and there was no undoing it. The investigation did not slow down after the first difficult days. It accelerated, expanding outward from Michael's backyard in ways that felt both inevitable and uncontrollable. Each morning brought more vehicles, more unfamiliar faces, more quiet conversations held just out of earshot. The detectives no longer spoke in cautious hypotheticals. Their language shifted, becoming firmer, shaped by patterns that were beginning to emerge from old files and newly uncovered evidence. Michael watched it all from a distance he had not chosen. He was no longer simply the homeowner who had made an unusual discovery. He was now a fixed point in a widening circle, the place where lines drawn from different times and places began to intersect. The backyard had become a reference point, a location spoken aloud in offices far from the neighborhood, written into reports and briefings. His address was now part of a larger story. The ambulance was lifted out of the ground 3 days after it was fully documented. The process was slow and deliberate, watched by technicians, detectives, and a small crowd of neighbors who pretended to be walking their dogs or checking their mail. A crane extended over the fence, cables secured to reinforced points beneath the vehicle. As it rose from the pit, soil falling away in clumps, Michael felt a strange sensation of loss mixed with relief. For a brief moment, he had almost come to think of the ambulance as a permanent feature of his life, something immovable and oppressive. Seeing it lifted into the open air made it feel finite, something that could be moved, examined, eventually taken away. The pit it left behind was deeper and wider than he had realized. The exposed soil showed clear signs of previous excavation, layers that did not align naturally, edges that had been cut cleanly and then concealed. The detectives took note of it all, photographing and measuring, confirming what Michael had already understood in his bones. This was not an accident. It was not neglect. It was a deliberate act of concealment. Inside the ambulance, away from the confines of the yard, the evidence began to speak more clearly. Michael was not present for most of it, but the detectives shared enough to make the shape of the truth impossible to ignore. The black folder was cataloged and preserved, its contents separated and scanned. The names were cross-referenced with missing persons reports from the past 15 years. Some matches were immediate. Others required deeper digging, looking past official records and into informal reports, hospital intake logs, shelter registries, and charity outreach files. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its consistency. The people listed in the folder were not random. They shared vulnerabilities that made them easy to overlook and easier to exploit. Many lacked stable housing. Some were undocumented. Others were elderly and lived alone, without close family. They were people who could call for help and then vanish without triggering the kind of alarms that followed disappearances in more visible parts of society. The private emergency service that had owned the ambulance had marketed itself as a low-cost alternative to traditional emergency medical services. It had operated on the margins, filling gaps left by overburdened public systems. On paper, it looked legitimate. It had licenses, contracts, insurance. In practice, it functioned in the gray spaces between oversight and neglect. According to the records now being uncovered, not every call handled by the service followed the same path. Some patients were delivered to hospitals as expected. Others were diverted. The folder listed addresses that were not medical facilities, warehouses, and converted buildings on the outskirts of the city, places that had since changed hands or been demolished. These locations were now being investigated, one by one, their histories reconstructed from fragments. Michael learned this in pieces, through conversations that always seemed to end just before the most disturbing details. The detectives were careful, aware of the strain already placed on him and his family. Still, the information seeped through, enough to form images he wished he could erase. People calling for help, trusting the uniform and the flashing lights, unaware that they were stepping into something designed to erase them. Lisa struggled with this knowledge more openly. She listened when the detective spoke, asked questions when Michael stayed silent, her need for understanding overriding her fear. At night, she replayed what she had heard, connecting it to faces she had seen at grocery stores, on street corners, people she might have passed without a second glance. "They didn't even know," she said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table long after the kids had gone to bed. "They thought they were being taken somewhere safe." Michael nodded, unable to find words that did not feel inadequate. As the investigation widened, so did the attention. The media arrived next, first cautiously, then with growing confidence as details leaked through unofficial channels. A van parked at the end of the street one morning, its logo unfamiliar. A reporter knocked on the door in the afternoon, smiling politely, holding a microphone just out of frame. Michael declined to comment, repeating what the detectives had told him to say. The questions continued anyway, asked through the closed door, shouted from the sidewalk. The neighborhood changed in subtle ways. Some neighbors expressed sympathy, offering meals, checking in. Others avoided eye contact, their discomfort manifesting as distance. A few were openly resentful, complaining about property values, about the street being blocked, about the attention that had found them through no fault of their own. Michael understood their frustration even as it stung. Everyone was paying a price now. The detectives uncovered more connections as days turned into weeks. The emergency service had not acted alone. It had been part of a network that included unlicensed clinics, corrupt administrators, and intermediaries who facilitated payments and falsified records. The ambulance buried in Michael's yard was not the only one involved, but it was the only one that had been hidden so completely, preserved with its evidence intact. When Michael asked why it had been buried instead of destroyed, the detective hesitated before answering. "Sometimes people hide things they plan to come back for," she said, "or things they don't have time to deal with properly." The implication lingered. The ambulance had been buried hastily, perhaps during a moment of panic, when exposure felt imminent. The people responsible might have intended to retrieve it later, to destroy it more thoroughly once the immediate danger had passed. That moment had never come. The folder had survived because it was overlooked, or because its importance was underestimated. Its existence now threatened to unravel years of careful obfuscation. Michael's role in all of this remained passive but inescapable. He was interviewed again and again, his statements compared and verified. He provided records from the home purchase, communications with the real estate agency, any correspondence that might shed light on how the property had been transferred. Investigators traced the ownership history back through shell companies and trusts, discovering that the land had changed hands several times in the years following the ambulance's burial, each transaction designed to obscure the past. Lisa's anxiety grew as the scope of the investigation became clearer. The voicemail Michael had received was no longer an isolated incident. Strange cars lingered on the street longer than seemed necessary. A man approached Michael at the grocery store, claiming to be a freelancer working on a story, asking questions that felt too informed to be innocent. The detectives assured them that there was no evidence of direct threats, but reassurance did little to dispel the tension that now defined their days. They installed additional locks, activated the old security system that had come with the house, but rarely been used. Michael found himself checking windows and doors with a frequency that bordered on compulsion. One afternoon, the detectives brought news that crystallized the stakes of the investigation. Several of the names in the folder had been conclusively matched to human remains discovered years earlier, unidentified at the time and buried under numbers instead of names. The connection had not been made then because the records had been fragmented, scattered across jurisdictions that did not communicate effectively. The folder provided the missing link. Families were being notified. Michael felt a hollow ache in his chest when he heard this. The story was no longer abstract, no longer about systems and schemes. It was about mothers and fathers, siblings and children, learning at last what had happened to someone they had waited for, sometimes for decades. Lisa cried that night, quietly, so the kids would not hear. Michael held her, feeling both helpless and complicit, even though he knew rationally that he bore no responsibility for the crimes themselves. The simple fact of proximity made guilt feel unavoidable. The media coverage intensified after the first arrests were made. Former administrators of the emergency service were taken into custody. A doctor associated with one of the clinics was detained at an airport, attempting to leave the country. Each development was reported with increasing detail, the narrative shifting from speculation to confirmation. Through it all, Michael remained careful, saying little, doing less. He followed instructions, attended meetings, answered questions. He became adept at explaining the situation to his children in ways that neither lied nor frightened them unnecessarily. He told them that something bad had happened a long time ago, that the police were fixing it, that they were safe. Whether that was entirely true remained uncertain. The city offered to relocate the family temporarily, citing safety concerns and the ongoing investigation. After long discussions, Michael and Lisa declined. Leaving felt like surrendering what little normalcy they still possessed. Staying felt risky, but it was a risk they could measure. As the weeks passed, one thing became increasingly clear. The ambulance buried in the yard had not been an isolated act of desperation. It had been part of a system that relied on invisibility, on the assumption that certain lives could disappear without consequence. By uncovering it, Michael had disrupted that assumption. He stood one evening at the edge of the pit, now empty and fenced off, and looked down at the exposed earth. It seemed impossible that something so ordinary as soil could hide so much. The investigation would continue without him, spreading outward, touching people and places he would never meet. But its origin would always be here, in this yard, in the place where he had simply wanted to build a pool. The truth had been hidden carefully, but not carefully enough, and now that it had been brought into the open, It refused to stay contained. By the time the arrests were announced publicly, Michael's home had ceased to feel like a refuge. It had become a place defined by tension, by constant vigilance, by the awareness that too many eyes were now fixed on it for reasons that had nothing to do with the family who lived inside. The investigation had moved beyond secrecy, and with that shift came exposure. The street was no longer just a street. It was a backdrop. The first news truck appeared early one morning, parking just far enough down the block to avoid violating any obvious restrictions. Michael noticed it through the living room window as he poured coffee, the familiar motion now accompanied by a tightness in his chest. The logo on the side was one he recognized from television. He stood there longer than necessary, watching as a man stepped out with a camera and tripod, scanning the houses as if deciding where to point his lens. Lisa joined him silently. She did not ask what he was looking at. She already knew. Within hours, there were more. Vans lined the street in uneven intervals, their presence transforming the quiet neighborhood into something closer to a staging area. Reporters gathered in small clusters, speaking into phones, rehearsing lines. When Michael stepped outside to take the trash to the curb, one of them called his name. "Michael, can you tell us how it feels to live on top of a crime scene?" He did not answer. He did not look at them. He placed the bin where it belonged and went back inside, his heart pounding harder than the simple act should have warranted. The door closed behind him with a finality that felt both comforting and insufficient. The children noticed the change immediately. They pressed their faces to the window, curiosity and fear mingling in their expressions. "Why are there cameras?" his daughter asked. Michael crouched beside her. "They're here because something important happened," he said carefully, "but it doesn't have anything to do with you." "Are we on TV?" his son asked. "No," Michael said quickly, "and we're going to keep it that way." Lisa spoke to the school that morning, arranging for the children to be picked up and dropped off discreetly. Even so, whispers followed them. Children repeated fragments of what they had heard at home, words like ambulance and bodies and backyard tumbling together without context. By the end of the week, Michael's daughter refused to go to school, her stomach hurting in a way that had nothing to do with illness. Inside the house, the atmosphere grew heavy. Lisa slept poorly, waking at the slightest noise, checking her phone repeatedly during the night. Michael found himself doing the same, scanning messages for threats that never quite materialized but always seemed possible. The voicemail from the unknown caller replayed in his mind, not because of what it said, but because of how little it had needed to say. The detectives maintained regular contact, their updates measured and careful. They advised Michael and Lisa not to engage with the media, not to post on social platforms, not to speculate publicly. They spoke of safety in practical terms, recommending additional lighting, reminding them to lock doors and windows, suggesting routines that minimized predictability. It was advice that made everything feel more fragile rather than more secure. Neighbors reacted in different ways. Some stopped by with food, small gestures of support that Michael appreciated more than he could express. Others avoided the house entirely, crossing the street when they saw him coming, their discomfort evident in the way they hurried past. A few were openly resentful, muttering about property values and traffic, about how their peaceful block had been turned into something resembling a spectacle. Michael understood their frustration, but understanding did not make it easier to bear. He had not chosen this. None of them had. One afternoon, as he returned from a meeting with the detectives, he noticed a car idling near the corner of the street. It was an older sedan, unremarkable except for the fact that he had seen it there the day before and the day before that. The driver did not look at him directly, but Michael felt watched all the same. He mentioned it to the detective later, who noted it down without visible alarm. "It could be nothing," she said, "but we'll keep an eye on it." Nothing felt like an increasingly narrow category. The most difficult moments came not from the media or the strangers, but from the people who sought Michael out for reasons he could not refuse. Families of the missing began to appear at the edge of the property, some alone, some together, clutching photographs, letters, anything that might connect them to the names that had finally resurfaced. One woman stood by the fence one evening, her face lined with exhaustion, holding a faded picture of a young man Michael did not recognize. She asked if she could speak with him. Michael hesitated, then nodded. "My brother," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "He called an ambulance years ago. That was last time anyone heard from him." Michael listened as she spoke, his own words failing him. He could offer no answers, no comfort beyond acknowledging her pain. When she left, thanking him for listening, he felt as though something had been taken from him, though he could not say what. Lisa struggled with these encounters. She wanted to help, to reach out, but each story weighed on her, adding to a sense of helplessness that grew heavier by the day. She began to avoid the front windows, to flinch at knocks on the door. At night, they talked in low voices after the children were asleep. Conversations turned toward contingencies they had never imagined needing to discuss. Where would the kids go if they needed to leave quickly? Who could be trusted with what information? How long they could endure living under this level of scrutiny? One evening, Lisa finally voiced what had been circling between them for weeks. "What if we can't do this anymore?" she asked. "What if staying here is hurting them more than leaving would?" Michael understood what she meant. He had asked himself the same question while watching his children retreat into themselves, their sense of safety eroded by things they did not fully understand. He also knew that leaving would not erase what had happened. It would follow them in questions, in headlines, in the way people recognize their names. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I just know that if we leave now, it won't stop anything. It might even make things worse." The pressure mounted as the investigation continued to produce results. More arrests were made. More names were released. Each announcement brought renewed attention, renewed interest in the place where it had all begun. The house became a symbol, whether Michael wanted it to or not. One night, a rock was thrown against the fence. It did not break anything, but the sound jolted Michael awake, his heart racing. He rushed outside with a flashlight, scanning the yard, the street beyond. There was no one there, only the echo of the impact and the unsettling knowledge that someone had been close enough to remind him of their presence. The detectives responded quickly, increasing patrols, reassuring Michael that they took the incident seriously. Still, the sense of being under siege deepened. Safety became something fragile, dependent on external forces he could not control. And yet, amid the fear and exhaustion, there were moments that reinforced why he had made the choice he did. A letter arrived one afternoon, handwritten, from a family who had received confirmation about a missing relative. They thanked Michael for calling the police, for not looking away. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that lingered long after he folded the paper and set it aside. That night, Michael stood in the backyard, the pit now covered and secured, and tried to remember what the space had felt like before. He could almost see it, The imagined pool, the children laughing. The vision felt distant, unreal. The house was still standing. The family was still together. But the siege was not just external. It had worked its way inside, into their routines, their thoughts, their sense of what was predictable. Michael knew that the next phase of this ordeal would demand more from them than endurance. It would demand participation, visibility, a willingness to step fully into a role he had never wanted. The truth was no longer hidden. And living with that truth meant accepting that the quiet life they had known here was gone, replaced by something far more uncertain and far more exposed. The day Michael received the official summons felt strangely quiet. No sirens, no cameras, no raised voices. Just an envelope delivered by a uniformed courier, handed over with a polite nod, as if it contained nothing more than a routine notice. He stood in the hallway for a long moment after closing the door, the paper heavy in his hands, aware that this was the point at which the story moved beyond investigation and into judgment. Lisa read the document with him at the kitchen table. The language was formal, precise, stripped of emotion. Michael was to appear as a key witness in multiple proceedings related to the illegal operations uncovered through the discovery of the ambulance. Dates were listed, locations, instructions. There was no room for hesitation written into those lines. "So, this is it," Lisa said quietly. "It's part of it," Michael replied. He had learned not to think in terms of endings anymore. Preparation began immediately. Lawyers contacted them, some assigned by the state, others representing families of the victims. Michael was advised on what to expect, how to answer questions, how to remain calm when confronted with attempts to undermine his credibility. He was told repeatedly that he had done nothing wrong. That reassurance felt necessary, but it did not erase the unease that settled in him as the court dates approached. The first hearing took place in a building that looked no different from any other courthouse Michael had passed without a second glance in the past. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with a sense of permanence. The hallways echoed with footsteps and low voices. People sat on benches waiting for their names to be called, each carrying their own version of urgency and dread. Michael took his seat behind the wooden barrier, Lisa beside him. Across the room, he saw faces he recognized only from news reports. Former administrators of the private emergency service, their expressions carefully neutral. Lawyers in tailored suits, their attention fixed on files and screens. A few rows behind them, families of the missing sat together, some holding hands, others staring straight ahead as if afraid to look anywhere else. When proceedings began, the language shifted again, becoming even more formal, more deliberate. Evidence was introduced piece by piece. Documents from the black folder were displayed, their significance explained by experts who traced patterns and connections with practiced clarity. Dates aligned. Addresses matched. Phone records filled in gaps that had once seemed insurmountable. Michael listened, his role passive for now, as the scope of the scheme was laid bare. The ambulance found in his backyard was described as a mobile link in a chain that spanned years and multiple jurisdictions. Testimony established how calls were diverted, how records were falsified, how patients were rerouted under the guise of emergency care. When Michael was called to the stand, the room seemed to contract around him. He stood, walked forward, and took the oath, his voice steady despite the tension coursing through him. He answered questions about the discovery, about the digging, about the moment he recognized the vehicle for what it was. He described the folder, the phones, the cash, sticking to what he had seen and done, resisting the urge to speculate. The defense attorneys questioned him next. Their approach was careful, probing for inconsistencies, suggesting alternative explanations without stating them outright. Was it possible the ambulance had been placed there before Michael purchased the property? Yes. Had he taken photographs before calling the police? No. Could someone else have accessed the yard without his knowledge? Unlikely, but not impossible. Michael answered calmly, drawing on the preparation he had been given, aware that every word mattered. He felt the weight of the family's eyes on him, not as scrutiny, but as expectation. He was not there to represent himself alone. As the days of testimony continued, more truths emerged. A former dispatcher testified under a plea agreement, describing the pressure to route certain calls differently, to use code words that masked illegal destinations. A clinic administrator admitted to falsifying intake records, his voice flat as he outlined practices that had once felt routine to him. A driver spoke about being instructed to follow routes that avoided hospitals, about the unease he had felt but ignored. Each confession tightened the narrative, leaving less room for doubt. The courtroom became a place where hidden actions were finally named, where the anonymity that had protected wrongdoing was stripped away. For the families, the proceedings were both painful and necessary. Some wept openly as details aligned with long-held suspicions. Others sat in silence, their grief contained but no less present. Michael watched them from his seat, understanding that the truth, even when it came, would not restore what had been lost. It would only give shape to absence. The verdicts, when they came, were measured. Some defendants received lengthy prison sentences. Others, having cooperated, faced reduced penalties. The judge spoke of systemic failure, of exploitation, of the consequences of allowing vulnerable populations to be overlooked. His words were careful, legal, but they carried an undercurrent of condemnation that resonated through the room. Michael felt no satisfaction as the sentences were read, only a quiet exhaustion and a sense that something heavy had finally been set down, though not removed. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, calling his name, asking for statements. Michael declined, repeating the same phrase he had practiced. He was there to support the process, not to speak beyond it. Lisa stayed close, her hand on his arm, guiding him through the crowd. In the weeks that followed, the attention slowly shifted away from the trial itself and toward its aftermath. Policy changes were announced, reviews initiated, promises made. Michael watched it all from a distance, aware that public interest would move on eventually, as it always did. For him and his family, the impact lingered. He returned to work, but the rhythm felt altered, his concentration fractured by memories of the courtroom, of the stories he had heard. Lisa resumed her routines, but with a new caution, a heightened awareness of the fragility of order. One evening, as they sat together after the children had gone to bed, Lisa spoke softly. "Do you ever wish you hadn't found it?" she asked. Michael considered the question carefully. He thought of the families who now had answers, however painful. He thought of the alternative, of the silence that would have continued if the ambulance had remained buried. "No," he said finally. "I wish it hadn't been there, but I don't wish we'd ignored it." Lisa nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The court proceedings had ended, but they had not closed the story. They had merely given it a public shape, a conclusion written in legal terms. The deeper consequences, the ones that touched lives and reshaped futures, would unfold more slowly. Michael understood now that truth, once exposed, demanded witnesses. It demanded people willing to stand in rooms like that courtroom and speak plainly about what they had seen. He had not chosen that role, but he had accepted it. And, in doing so, he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, leaving behind the quiet anonymity of the life he once knew. The end did not arrive with a clear sound or a single moment that could be pointed to and named. There was no day when Michael woke up and felt that everything was finished. Instead, the aftermath unfolded slowly, in small administrative steps and quiet decisions, and conversations that took place behind closed doors and letters that arrived in plain envelopes. The trials were over, the sentences handed down, the headlines moving on to other stories, but the consequences settled into the spaces where life continued. The city's offer came a few weeks after the final hearing. It was delivered through official channels, explained carefully, framed as a practical solution rather than a gesture. The property, they said, would be purchased at full market value, with additional compensation for relocation expenses. The land would be reassessed, the house eventually demolished. The area where the ambulance had been buried would be documented and marked, not as a spectacle, but as a matter of record. Michael read the letter twice before setting it down. He had expected something like this, and yet the confirmation carried a weight he had not anticipated. The house, for all the fear and exhaustion it now represented, was still their home. It held birthdays, arguments, ordinary evenings, memories that had nothing to do with what had been found beneath the yard. Letting go of it felt like conceding that the past could overwrite everything that had come after. Lisa read the letter silently, then folded it and placed it back on the table. She did not cry. Instead, she nodded, a small, decisive motion. "I think we should accept," she said. Michael looked at her, searching for hesitation, for doubt. He found none. What he saw instead was weariness, the kind that came from carrying a burden for too long. "The kids need a place where they don't feel watched," she continued, "where they can just be kids again." Michael thought of their son glancing nervously at strangers on the street, of their daughter flinching when a car slowed near the house. He thought of the nights spent listening for sounds that never quite resolved into threats, of the constant awareness that the story was not entirely theirs to control. "Okay," he said. The decision, once made, seemed to bring a strange sense of calm. Practical matters took over. Paperwork, appraisals, meetings with realtors in a different part of the state. The children were told, gently, that they would be moving. They asked questions, worried about schools, about friends. Michael and Lisa answered as honestly as they could, promising stability even as they navigated uncertainty themselves. Packing began slowly, boxes filled with objects that felt heavier now that they were being handled with the knowledge that they would not return to their places. Michael found himself pausing over small things, a mark on the wall where the kids had measured their height, a loose board on the deck he had always meant to fix. Each item carried a version of the life he had expected to continue there. On the day the moving truck arrived, Michael stood in the backyard one last time. The pit had been filled, the ground leveled, the grass reseeded, but the area still looked different to him. He could not see it without remembering the shape of the ambulance emerging from the soil, the moment when his plans had collided with something buried and unresolved. A small group gathered near the edge of the property as the city workers installed the marker. It was simple, unobtrusive, bearing a brief inscription that listed names and dates without explanation. No speeches were made. There were no cameras. A few family members of the victim stood quietly, some holding flowers, others simply watching. Michael kept his distance, unsure of his place in that moment. He did not feel like a participant so much as a witness, someone whose role had been to open a door and then step aside. Still, one of the women he recognized from earlier visits approached him. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for not closing your eyes." Michael nodded, words failing him again. He had learned that gratitude, when it came in circumstances like these, was not something to accept lightly. The house was demolished weeks later. Michael did not watch. He received notice when it was done, a brief update that marked the end of that chapter in bureaucratic terms. The image of the walls coming down existed only in his imagination, and he found that he preferred it that way. The move took them to a smaller town, farther from the city, a place where anonymity came more easily. The new house was modest, unremarkable, its yard ordinary in the way Michael had once taken for granted. There was no plan for a pool. There was no grand project waiting to be started. For the first time in months, that absence felt like relief rather than loss. The children adapted more quickly than Michael had expected. New routines formed. New friends appeared. Laughter returned to the house in a way that did not feel forced. Lisa slept better, her rest no longer interrupted by the constant vigilance that had defined the previous year. Michael returned to working with his hands, small projects that required focus without carrying larger implications. He built shelves in the garage, repaired a loose step on the porch, planted a young tree in the backyard one afternoon, digging carefully, aware of every sound the shovel made as it met the soil. The earth here was soft, unremarkable, offering no resistance beyond what was expected. Still, there were moments when the past intruded. News articles surfaced occasionally, marking anniversaries, revisiting the case with a tone that suggested closure. Michael read them rarely. He did not need reminders. The experience had settled into him, shaping the way he looked at the world, the assumptions he no longer made about what lay beneath ordinary surfaces. One evening, sitting on the back steps of the new house, Michael watched his children play in the yard, their voices carrying easily through the air. The tree he had planted stood nearby, its leaves small and bright. The ground around it was smooth, freshly turned, nothing hidden, nothing waiting to be uncovered. He thought of the question Lisa had asked him months earlier, whether he ever wished he had not found the ambulance. The answer remained the same, though it had deepened with time. He wished that the crimes had never occurred, that the systems had not failed, that people had not been exploited. But he did not wish he had looked away. There were lives that would never be restored, futures that had ended long before he had put a shovel into the ground, but there were also families who no longer had to wonder, who no longer had to live with unanswered questions. That knowledge did not erase the cost, but it gave it meaning. As the light faded and the evening settled in, Michael stood and brushed the dirt from his hands, a familiar gesture that no longer carried the same unease. He looked at the house behind him, at the quiet yard, at the ordinary life they were rebuilding piece by piece. The ground here held nothing but roots and stones, and for the first time since that day in the old backyard, that was enough. If this story made you stop and think, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. More stories like this are already on the channel, and new ones are coming soon. Share this video with someone who should see it, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what you think really happened.